knows everything, but everyone knows something no one else knows, including you. Welcome to the other side of things. I'm your host, Dr. Michael DiMaria, and for 35 years, I've been a guide of the soul. On the other side of things, we explore alternative perspectives on challenging topics, ranging from love, sex, death, and madness to dream work, breath work, and other cutting-edge healing modalities. We live on a precipice as a species. So let's jump in. Welcome to another episode of The Other Side of Things. For those who've been listening to my other podcast, Musitations, it continues to this day to explore my holy trinity of nature, creativity, and spirituality, and particularly looking at the creative process as a mindful, meditative healing process, and how critical, in my mind, we all need a creative outlet just as much as a physical outlet. So, on the other side of things, we like to explore what I call the three themes that have been so interwoven in my life since my near-death experience at 7, as being a recovering circumcision trauma child, and being raised Catholic, that the themes of love, death, and madness have woven their way in and out of my life, and in particular, 33 years as a Jungian psychologist. So I'm really excited. We have an amazing guest today, and author, speaker, and she's an extraordinary human being. And without further ado, I'm just going to bring her on and introduce her, and we'll see where today takes us. We have a juicy, juicy topic. Jessica Fern is a psychotherapist, coach, and certified clinical trauma professional. Jessica is the author of Polysecure, Attachment, Trauma, and Non-Monogamy, the Polysecure Workbook, the Polysecure Workbook, and Polywise, a deeper dive into navigating open relationships. In her international private practice, Jessica works with individuals, couples, and people in multiple partner relationships who no longer want to be limited by their reactive patterns, cultural conditioning, insecure attachment styles, and past traumas, helping them to embody new possibilities in life and love. And you can learn more about Jessica at jessicafern.com. Jessica, it's such an honor and joy to have you here today. Welcome.
Thank you, Michael. I'm genuinely excited for us to talk.
Thank you so much. Well, I always like to start with guests that, particularly how I came across your work. You know, it was the beginning of COVID, and for 33 years in my practice, over and over and over again, I found, people, particularly in relationship, I saw so many. I often said I saw two main things torpedo relationships. One, unrealistic expectations, and number two, making the other person responsible for your happiness, which has a lot to do with how we're seeking out someone to be the good mother or the good father, or our attachment wounds. I also saw people over 3.5 decades explore everything from open marriages, or see how devastating affairs and other kinds of, not just even physical affairs, but what they would call emotional affairs or spiritual affairs, or just, noticing what you talk about so beautifully as, dyadic withdrawal, or this, kind of protective covering, which then limits both people. So I came across a review of your book, Polysecure. And I, basically, because when I was working with many couples, I try to educate myself, and read many of the standard things that have a lot of valuable things in them. The Ethical Slut, More Than Two, um, the Dawn of Sex, many of these incredible books, but they seem to miss the attachment piece. And they also often missed what I thought of as really this deeper message of what's happening to love. And so I downloaded your audiobook. I was walking during COVID, like miles at night, and I put it in and I hear your voice. If anybody wants to read this amazing book, I suggest the audio version because Jessica's voice is so calming. And the first words I hear is, gets me emotional. I wrote this book for love. And immediately you had me hooked. And I had never read a book about non-monogamy or polyamory with such heart, which
Mm,
such thoughtfulness,
mm,
with such insight about our psychological attachment makeup. So, and for those who don't know, I have been consulting with you because I'm hoping this podcast, The Other Side of Things, will also evolve into a book and maybe documentary. And one of the themes I want to explore is this tension between monogamy and non-monogamy.
yeah.
So I wanted to give that introduction and wherever that may take us. But for those who aren't familiar, well, anyway, I'm going to give you a chance to respond to that if there's any thoughts or expressions that about that in
Uh,
particular and how that book's touched so many people.
yeah, well, just thank you. Yeah, it makes even me tear up a little bit as you're quoting my first line.
Mm,
And, you know, writing a book, of course, I wanted it to be smart, of
mm.
intelligent book, but I wanted it to have heart. And so it just feels so good. I've got received that feedback before, and so that my intention actually came through. Because that's the mystery in this. I didn't know this book would touch so many people. I didn't know the impact it would have until it did. Right. So in the writing process, there's so much unknown. Will anyone read this? Will it make a difference? Yeah.
Well, you've definitely struck a chord with your audience,
Yeah.
and it's touched a lot of people. And if for those who aren't familiar with polyamory, if there was a way to introduce, like, because I know there's a lot of myths and misconceptions, and
Yeah.
how might you distinguish it from other relationship styles or structures? And if you can maybe share about how you became interested in the first place.
Yeah. So, polyamory or non-monogamy, ethical non-monogamy, consensual non-monogamy, those are the umbrella terms for many different ways to have more than one romantic or emotional or sexual partner. And it's not cheating. Everyone involved knows about it. And this has existed for a very long time, right? Sex at Dawn really gets into some of the anthropology of that. Apparently, as long as there's been humans, we haven't necessarily been monogamous, right? And so I got involved. I had experience being non monogamous since I was 14. There was just no language for it. I didn't know what was happening. It was just what was happening. There wasn't a construct at that time for me. But then when I was working as a psychotherapist and had couples coming to me and saying they wanted to explore opening up their relationship, I realized, like, oh, I have some personal experience, but I have no professional experience with this at all. I need to figure this out quick. And at the time, there wasn't really anything out there that was helpful from a, clinical therapeutic standpoint, especially. There were some of the books that you had named, but those weren't sufficient to be helping people, in the therapy room, right? Figuring out how to transition into a different paradigm, how to work with all the different challenges that come up in this specific paradigm compared to what we kind of know in monogamy.
Yeah, no, beautiful. And I think it's spoken to so many people in the clinical setting as well. And I know, I mean, I'm just honored to be following your interview with Esther Perel, that you were on
Mhm.
her podcast. And, just the way her two TED Talks have gone viral, the state of
Amazing.
affairs and um, how, what is the other one? Her name.
Dating in captivity.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, mating in captivity. So given that, it is challenging, challenging these traditional norms, the cultural norms, cultural
Yeah.
paradigms, and this sense of you mentioned in the new book, Polywise, which again, I also highly recommend. I was so waiting for this, and it came out last year, correct? The end of last year.
Yes.
And I really love how you and actually co-written with the your first husband and also the father of your son, right?
Exactly.
So well done. And again, you both bring such heart to it, but you really talk about this shift in paradigm. And maybe you could talk a little bit about, what that means and why
Yeah.
we're looking at something that, there's these initial reactivity we have, and how moving out of a mindset where
Yeah.
maybe even being curious about our reactivity and how that comes from shifting a paradigm.
Yeah. And I'd love for you to add to this, but thinking of paradigms are kind of the water we're swimming in, right? It's like
Yes.
the worldview, the reality, the narratives, the discourse that often we take for granted. Our paradigms are very invisible most of the time,
Yes.
right? We think it's truth and it's not necessarily truth. It's a paradigm, right? It's an opinion,
Yes. Yes.
right? It's a way, it's a lens. That's an easy, way of saying it's a lens through which we're seeing the world. And so it's a big deal to change that lens. Right? It's a really big deal, because often the original paradigm is deeply ingrained, right, into our emotional wiring. Like thinking of, what's the worst thing that happens in a monogamous relationship? Maybe death of the partner, but if they've been living, it would be cheating is usually considered, right? Or betrayal, right? And forms of betrayal. And so we have these emotional reaction wirings in us for those types of experiences, right? That my partner with someone else would be a massive threat. And now in this other paradigm, I'm supposed to celebrate this. I don't know how to do that.
Mm.
Right?
Yes.
Right. Some people do. Some people, it's who they are. They can embrace it or they can shift really easily. It's incredible. But for a lot of people, they're like, I want to do this, but the old paradigm is still within.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or you,
Beautiful.
yeah. Or you hit up against, like you're saying, the rest of the world, that still believes that these things are what's most natural or ethical or right.
Yeah. No, beautiful. I love the example of, you know, a, uh, a patriarchal monotheistic God, that God as a man,
Mhm.
is a paradigm,
Yeah.
and that the shifting to thinking of God as feminine or non-gendered is for many people just there's such reactivity, because
Right.
again, how we're taught and at such a young age and what we're exposed to, and again this word narrative, this whole movement in narrative psychology is to question the narratives that you've been taught, and realizing that they create a, yes, lens filter, that how we can or cannot see it, it predetermines what we're capable
Exactly.
of seeing or not seeing.
Right.
So that's, I think it's such a big piece of the puzzle. And that's why I think this is such a critical discussion, because the other thing that you bring up, which it really touched me, and helped me, and part of my own journey as a man in a monogamous relationship for, well, married 41 years, in relationship 46, had broken up twice, when my wife and I were in college and high school sweethearts.
High school sweethearts.
High school, 15 years old, and we just had our 41st anniversary last year. That having been said, polyamory literally means many loves.
Right.
It doesn't in and of itself mean many lovers. It
That's
may,
true.
it
Yeah.
may. And I know, I've always, and it was a period of time in my relationship with my wife where, my connection to, I've always gotten along with women better than men. I have so many, called soul sisters, or people who've been so nourishing to my own heart. And those times where, and again, it's funny because she gets along with men better than I do, so it's really funny where she has a lot of men friends. I have a lot of female friends, but it was validating, and seeing, though, when those sticky moments would come up, that, wait a minute, that that, and I think this is a big piece, is that, I mentioned this dyadic withdrawal, or this sense of, in terms of what happens in relationship. And Esther Perel talks about this so beautifully too. We start, well, the unrealistic expectation piece, when we start imagining or thinking one person is going to fulfill all of our needs,
Yeah.
that's a really mistaken assumption. In
Right.
terms of the loss of interconnectivity. And we know now more than ever that, it's like a diverse ecosystem. The
Right.
more an ecosystem is a monoculture, the less sustainable it is. Think of a cornfield is not going to survive drought or flood, but
Exactly.
a old growth forest where there's a lot of diversity, it's more sustainable. So I'm curious how many people you find where it's more opening up the relationship to other emotional relationships that may have
Mhm.
previously been threatening, not necessarily sexual.
It exists. Yes. I mean, I couldn't give like a percentage, but absolutely that's a part of it for people is they realize they have this expansion of, right, it's not just about necessarily having sexual lovers. It could be just about having more friends,
Right.
or polyintimates, right, which are I use that term. I didn't coin that term, but I use that term as like their friendship doesn't fit, you know. There's a deeper intimacy or commitment or experience together, right? That's notable.
Yeah. No,
Often
that's
would be threatening in a very
right.
strict, right, monogamous structure. Yes.
And I remember, you've mentioned this a few times in your work that I really love is, so people out there, let's say they have someone, a partner who's coming to them and says, I'm wondering if I'm polyamorous, or I'm curious about this. And when I've seen you handle this so skillfully, which was like, okay, because that person may become totally unglued, right? But the idea, you'd say, well, wait a minute, I'm not saying I'm going to act on this, but can we be playful and just talk about,
About it.
right? Say more
Yeah.
about what are the ways you find when this topic comes up with couples, because I think the danger is, and I do think it seems to be with those I've worked with, there's so much shame, almost like coming out as gay 20, 30 years ago, that if somebody kind of even talks about, they're immediately shut down, or they may
Right.
not have the courage to bring it up because of the fear of losing a relationship or rejection. So
Yeah.
what are some tips or things to share about how to move into that conversation in a way that may feel less threatening, and the importance of having that conversation?
Yeah. Well, if you're wanting it and you're in a monogamous relationship, yes, that conversation is very important. And to see it as something that to go slowly, yet be also persistent at the same time, right? Like if your partner reacts to the first mention of non-monogamy and shuts it down, don't just give up on that necessarily, right? Because I've seen so many people who need time to warm up to it. And initially, it's just a horrible idea to them. They think, I don't want this at all. And then within a year, they're the person who's like doing it even more, right? Like I see this a lot. So think about, because when we start off on the wrong foot with non-monogamy, it's very hard. So the
Mm,
wrong foot usually would be this actually was cheating and now you want to open up. That's a harder way to open up.
right.
You go to your partner and say, this is who I am, and in whatever kind of words they basically deal with it, this is what we're doing, or you got to join me or you're out, right? That's not a great way to start this. Just like if you're in a partnership, ideally you wouldn't just say, I took a new job in a new state.
Mm,
Right, you'd come and say, hey, there's this thing that I'm contemplating, I'm curious, we have to talk about this together. So like any other big decision, opening up a relationship is a massive decision that's ideally not unilateral. So bringing it up is, hey, this is something I want to talk about. I think I have interest in it, but I'm not going to do anything until we talk about it. And if the partner reacts, you can even say, I see that this is bringing up triggers for you, and I don't want to actually give up on this conversation. So Can you let me know when we can come back to it?
Mm, beautiful.
Yeah, don't
Mm,
let your partner stay in reactivity, and don't let reactivity be what rules this conversation. I mean,
beautiful.
that would be with anything, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Well, why
Yeah.
don't you say a little more about what is reactivity? I'm sure people have their common everyday understanding, but how would you define reactivity?
Yeah, I define it in a few ways. So, from a nervous system perspective, it's probably a sympathetic nervous system activation of the actual threat response. We call it I get triggered, and we feel our physiology change. And we're in a different nervous system. So, we don't have access to our higher functioning and our resources and our hearts being open and our rationality, even.
So
Yeah.
we are our objectivity is impaired
Is we're totally
because right.
impaired,
Yeah.
right? That's a great way to say it. We're
Yes.
impaired when we're triggered, when we're activated, when we're
Dysregulated.
dysregulated, exactly. Or I think of what part of you is reacting. So
Mm,
from the heart's perspective, right? I might have an adult angry part that's reacting, or I might have a young child wounded part that's actually reacting to this, or all of the above. And that's one of the things I find with whether it's non-monogamy or not is exploring which parts are having this reactivity. Yeah.
beautiful. Yeah, no,
And
and you do
figuring out
that
that.
so
Yeah.
yeah, so well in your work. And that's something we have in common because both of my Jungian background and psychosynthesis background, and then of course internal family systems, understanding parts work seems so very important. And for those who maybe say a few words about describing, because those of us outside of the biz, right, might have a
Right.
little of what is a part, what do you mean I'm parts of me? um
Right.
how might you phrase that to a lay person?
Yeah, that as humans, we have multiple aspects, parts, voices of ourselves, and we intuitively know it when we say something like, I want to go, but I kind of want to stay home. Right? Those are two different
Right,
parts, different
right.
desires, or it was bittersweet, right?
Yeah, I
Um,
want to lose weight but I don't want to give up cake.
Right. So there's a part that wants to be healthy, and there's a part that wants to indulge and
Yes,
doesn't want to have to deal with any food restrictions, right?
right.
Yes. And we've all heard of things like the inner critic or the inner child. So these would be different parts of us. And so IFS, internal family systems, which is my main parts modality, would say, all parts are welcome.
Mm,
But there are some parts that can get into extreme roles, sort of as protectors, right? Or they're holding wounds, they're holding traumas. And it's not about getting rid of these parts at all. It's about basically transforming them, healing them, so that they can be better integrated into our system and sort of helpful parts.
beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, I
Or
always like to yeah, that's beautifully put. I always like to say it's two different in psychosynthesis with subs. We'd say the only two problems with subs, we all have all these multiple sides, and one is the inability to access a subpersonality or part, and the other is being stuck in one and not be able to disidentify from it.
yes,
Right.
exactly.
So
Right,
yeah, that if we
right.
whatever we over identify with has power over us. What we disidentify, we actually have some power objectivity over. Which brings up this question I've wanted to ask you, you know, does everybody have a poly part?
Good question. I don't know if everyone does, but we can say a lot of people have poly parts. That doesn't necessarily mean you're expressing that part of you.
Right. Right.
I mean, the research on sexual fantasies, the most common sexual fantasy is of threesomes from people that are practicing or say they're monogamous, is my understanding.
I didn't know
So,
that. That's
yeah,
fascinating. Yeah.
yeah.
I think I learned
Justin
something
A.
new here.
Miller's work, yeah, on fantasy is really fun. So you're going, okay, so right, they might not be expressing that polyamory in the world, but that's a polyamorous part that's fantasizing about having a multiple partner experience.
No,
Yeah.
that's wonderful. What it reminds me very much of, when the Kinsey report looked at heterosexual and homosexual spectrum, and all of a sudden it was like, no, well, actually, especially when there was anonymous reporting, that
Mhm.
there wasn't a pure homosexual or heterosexual preference, that it was on a continuum. And you had people
Yeah,
who were exclusively heterosexual in their lifestyle and choices, with a rare homosexual thought or feeling, to moderate homosexual thought or feeling, to, quite a bit, but still choose the heterosexual lifestyle, and then
yeah,
bisexual, where you have mixed feelings for both, but, and those who choose to live that lifestyle or not, and then moving in the other direction of homosexuality in the same way.
exactly.
So,
Right.
do you see monogamy and polyamory on a possibly similar spectrum?
I do. I see it on a spectrum where if we have monogamy on one end and polyamory on the other, right, there's people that really feel to themselves on those ends to be wired that way for one partner or multiple partners. And they feel like this is who they fundamentally are. It's like their essence. It's not
Right.
something they're choosing, right? And then there's a lot of people in the middle. There's a term ambiamorous, which I really like, right? Or some people say polyfluid or monofluid, right? Which is capturing that people might move up and down the spectrum depending on many different factors going on.
Including what's going on in their life at the time, right? You,
Yeah.
you bring that up in Polywise. And by the way, they're the best titles ever, Polysecure and Polywise, because you're really bringing that combination. And for me, the other reason I'm thank you for all that, and I think that's so important. In fact, it reminds me. In fact, I one of the people on this podcast coming is also Jorge
Mhm.
Ferrer, who, has coined the term,
Yes,
novogamy, which
right.
means kind of new relationship freedom. And
Mhm.
you mentioned him, I know, in
Mhm.
Polysecure. Um, did you want to? Well, actually, before we get to that, because I want to get this point in, and then we may come back around. But to me, just like a monoculture in what we've done with nature, which is, one of my main concerns and pet peeves, at how we have lost the ability to, regenerative farming, um,
Right.
clear cutting old growth forests, permaculture, that the key of how we need more diversity. And there's, as a Jungian psychologist too, for over 3 decades, we'd have a saying that whatever God you didn't honor is the one who'll bring you down. And
Mhm.
and the idea was, there is that when we moved from, polytheism to monotheism, there was this loss, and in terms of sometimes the multiplicity of honoring, that there was a spirit in the trees, or there was a, different god of the sky, or a god of water, or, working so much with indigenous cultures and animistic cultures, or sometimes called the animate everything, that when everything is seen as a spirit. Matthew Fox brings up the interesting idea in polyentheism. He actually says there's multiplicity and polytheism and theism together. Like, you can have mono and poly together. This idea of
Mhm.
unity in multiplicity, unity in diversity, which actually the EU, the European Union, that is actually their motto, is unity and diversity. So I just wanted to put that for anybody out there having a little reactivity, that, it's that we all are, even as we're understanding ourselves as parts,
Yeah.
as subs, that we are a diverse ecosystem of potentialities. And I think just opening our hearts to that poly, and in fact, James Hillman, big neo Jungian, I loved, and hope not going too far afield, he would say the soul is polytheistic,
Mm.
where the ego is monotheistic.
That's really, yeah,
Right? Isn't that kind of nice? And
I like
I like to say the ego is a child of society and stuck in the paradigm of that society.
exactly.
The
Exactly.
soul is a child of nature with tremendous capacity for permeability, for kind of a shifting, changing, like the river, which is one of my favorite themes. So anyway, those are a couple of things I want to mention too. So if there's any of that you want to respond to, or yeah, there you have it.
Absolutely. Well, I will say that my like soul, my being is poly, but that doesn't always mean I have multiple partners,
Mm,
right? Just like someone might have a certain sexual identity but might be celibate or not have a sexual partner. It doesn't
right.
take away from the other. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's beautiful. Well, when you said, and I think that was a point I wanted to come back to too, is that there are people can be poly by essence, by being their very being versus by choice or
Hmm.
even situation.
Yeah, exactly. And some people argue that it's a lifestyle. No, it's an orientation. And for me, it's all of the above.
Mm,
Right? It can be situational, it can be a choice, it can be a philosophy, it can be an orientation. Because I just see people that's how their experience is. Yeah. So I think it's important we allow that spectrum even within polyamory to exist instead of it having to be a certain way.
beautiful,
Yeah.
beautiful. So, jealousy,
Yes.
navigating jealousy, it's so common in our world and in relationships. We get so, particularly when we, have our person, that idea in our culture, and I kind of cringe a little bit whenever hear somebody says, oh, you complete me,
Yeah.
the idea that there is the one, where there you have that mono thing again, the one that somehow you are not going to ever have a feeling about another human being your entire life. And I think that that's, even when I do pre-marriage counseling, when I did for years, I'd often say, well, I'm hearing a lot about romance but nothing about marriage, which is, once the honeymoon wears off, which is that word comes from the honey lasted a moon, for one moon, which to me can be 3 hours to 3 years. But that tendency to all of a sudden notice that your partner is, oh, they're talking to this person at the party a little bit, more interestingly, or they're listening better than they ever listened to me. What are ways in which um, people navigating and addressing jealousy in the context of polyamory? And if
Mhm.
you find that I don't want to say that practicing polyamory will make you immune to jealousy, but
No.
your thoughts and feelings about that. And in fact, or can it be the opposite? Help shed some light for us about that.
Yeah, jealousy happens everywhere. And so, yes, is jealousy probably, are you betting at a higher frequency when there's multiple partners? Yes. But within the paradigm of polyamory, people really embrace jealousy. It's one of the really lovely thing about it, or a principle, I'd say, is or values is sort of moving towards jealousy and not being afraid of it. Also, not denying that we're jealous, right? Not letting it become toxic jealousy. And I talk about seeing it as a messenger. Jealousy is telling us something important about ourselves, about our partnership, or even about the society and culture that we're in. Yeah. And so sometimes it's like jealousy is this trigger from my own stuff, my own insecurities. I'm comparing, or, my own shame, right? My own traumas that have nothing really to do with my partner. Sometimes, though, it really is exposing an issue that's been in the relationship that needs to be addressed. So even that little example you gave, like, oh, someone's listening to me better than my partner.
Right.
Right? Well, yeah, that's information.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Okay, wait a minute. I don't think we've been listening to each other very well, or there's a
Mm,
need to be heard that hasn't been being met in this relationship. And through the experience of other connections, I'm realizing there's some needs here that haven't been met. And that's a hard one. Yeah. But yeah, people are just willing to deal with jealousy, talk about jealousy. And there are people that it is incredible. They just don't seem to get as jealous. Yeah, but I wouldn't say that's the norm in non-monogamy,
right.
right? But yeah.
No, that's beautiful. It brings up another one of the themes I'd often share with couples, and because this is doesn't matter if you choose monogamy or not. This is what This was the grist of the mill, even for me working with monogamous couples for 3.5 decades. Well, I can't believe you're paying so and so attention, or you want, jealousy. And I always like to say, everyone lights up a different side of us.
Yeah.
If we are this incredible, like this beautiful, particularly for me, the soul is this prism of infinite potentiality. I mean, think of the double helix of DNA for me is like that's who we are, is this extraordinary, you know, well, we really don't fully know who we are, but what I do know, especially from my near death experience, is that we know very little about the extraordinary dynamism of the soul and our
Mhm.
interaction with this world that actually is us and we are the world. I mean, it's this, and I shared with you just before we started, it's a one of these gorgeous blue sky days on the Gulf Coast. And, just getting ready, I looked out the window and there's big, beautiful bald eagle, just like in their joy of just on the top of this huge tree out there, probably 100 feet up, with the wind, blowing in the leaves. And for me, this kind of that we are the world, as Krishnamurti would say, and the world is us, or that each of us are a world, and with tremendous infinite potentiality. So why wouldn't, just like this eagle lit me up, we
Mhm.
meet people in our lives that light us up.
Light us up. Exactly.
And as opposed to, I have this like screenplay in my mind that I keep playing with, and the working title is Imagine, which would be a futuristic, not a dystopia, but kind of more utopian, like on the other side of whatever it is we're going to be going through the next 50 to 100 years as a culture. But where there's kind of museums of religion and
Mm.
and even looking at different relationship styles. But one of the things is, again, as a Jungian psychologist, the idea of anima animus work
Yeah.
is, as opposed to rejecting when someone lights you up, be curious, like you said, like not only what may be not addressed in the relationship, but what am I not fulfilling in myself?
Yes.
And so this idea, like for me, like I think I've shared with you before, I have my outer marriage
Yes.
ring and my inner marriage ring.
Yeah.
And one of those is the question I'll ask people as a Jungian psychologist was, who's the lover who's been hiding inside all the lovers you've had? That's a spiritual reality. Some tradition might call it the white sacred buffalo woman or man. And that what and oftentimes a person is mirroring or reflecting parts of ourself we are unaware of or not embracing or not living out. And I think that's why, if people can be open to the understanding of the paradigm of polyamory, it could actually also open them, even if they don't choose the lifestyle, to be curious and inquire about,
Mm.
that's the first thing I'd have people do. If they're attracted to somebody, write down the qualities
Qualities.
that you
Yes.
love in them, and then ask yourself how, not how your partner's not necessarily fixing, but how are you not living those qualities or finding those qualities either in a relationship, friendship, or within yourself. So I don't know if that took us too far afield, but I'd love to hear any thoughts about that.
Yeah, well, it's making me think of a relationship I was in my 20s, and we were monogamous, but we both had a crush on the same person.
Oh, I
We
love
both
it. I
developed
love
this,
it.
we were doing this joint project, and we both had this started crushing on the same person. And so it came out, we told each other, and what we realized in that situation, I was like, am I actually attracted, really like want to be with that person? Or do I just admire that person? And what
Mm,
you were saying is we realized this third person represented, embodied certain things that I was wanting to embody for myself.
right.
Yeah. And it was a great
Beautiful.
learning. We didn't pursue being with that person in any way, but it was a real great, like, it kind of dissolved actually. I just appreciated that person, and it didn't feel like a crush so much when I realized, oh, it's that I admire them and they have a certain way of being that I want for myself.
Beautiful. Oh, I
Yeah.
love that way of being. I think that's,
Yeah.
because often that's what we can get drawn to or attracted to in someone.
Right. But I do want to just, of course, mention, I mean, as you're referencing even monogamous couples, right? Statistically, not many people who are saying they're monogamous are practicing monogamy.
Yes, yes, it's something
So,
that Jorge brings up. It's like that it's touted in
yeah,
public but not practiced. And
it's
it's,
spouse, right, but not
right.
practice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I used to call it the Jimmy Swaggart syndrome. It's like I'm gonna, I don't know, you're too young to remember Jimmy, but
Okay.
here, right, he was a evangelical preacher who would preach fire and brimstone and going to hell, and then as soon as he left, he'd go and look for troll for prostitutes, you know.
Yeah.
And
Right.
so that incredible, and even psychology, that's actually another one of the biggest parts, or even the shadow, those parts of us we would actually vehemently deny are part of
Right.
us, which
Our
actually,
exile part. Yeah.
right, exiled parts that, and how often do we see this, that homophobia is actually
Yeah.
hiding deep ambiguity or actual homosexual feelings? So I think the same thing could be said of polyamory, would you say?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, if you most people, if you say, "Oh, have you only been attracted to one person your entire life?" I haven't heard someone say yes.
Right, right,
You might have only had one partner your whole entire life. That's what you've chosen, but
right.
rarely is that actually experienced.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And wouldn't you say it's a beautiful thing when a couple is comfortable enough with each other that they could actually share, even if they're not choosing polyamory, to
Yeah.
share their attraction to other people
And
without
that's
it being threatening? And not that you're doing it in a way to be critical of the other person, but just as, what, there's a beautiful eagle out front, or boy, he was really handsome,
that
or
one's cute, right?
right. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When Dave and I got married, our agreement was we don't own each other's sexuality. We didn't want that. And even though we were being sexually exclusive, we knew like we don't own each other's sexuality. Like, of course, we're going to be attracted to other people. And the agreement was that we bring that to each other before we would ever act on it.
Right.
Right. And so there were times of saying, oh, yeah, there's an attraction to this person. What do we think? What do I do? Is it just they embody, the positive shadow, or is it an actual attraction? Yeah.
Beautiful. Yeah. And that's where I think the one thing that still was part of my healing from, growing up the way I did with trauma, um, you know uh, genital trauma, but also emotional trauma, and also growing up in the religious environment that I did, was that my sexuality was mine and no one else's. And I
Yeah.
would say that would be something I would want to really leave with listeners out there too, is that particularly in our patriarchal culture, there is a message in which, how many times I would hear someone say, well, it's my uh, marital duty to have sex even when I don't want to, and how destructive that was to the intimacy. And I think this is another thing about being honest with yourself and each other about sexual feelings, needs, um,
Yeah.
preferences, or just being able to say no too.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's for anybody, but often it does coincide with opening up.
Mm,
There's a correlation of opening up to non-monogamy and many people feeling this, sexual, even sexual, spiritual awakening that happens for them because of this.
so we're starting to see more and more, uh, you know, examples or expressions of ethical non-monogamy, in cultural settings, from books to like yours, to movies, to popular culture. What is your current feeling about maybe misconceptions, or how the public's perception is either changing or not changing, or where there might be room for improvement, or the particular challenges that we face as a culture today dealing with these non traditional relationship structures and styles.
Yeah, I think it's improving and it still has a way to go. I think it's great that we're seeing it in more places like podcasts, right, that are devoted to the topic. There's tons of them. So this is great because it's needed. We'll just say that, right? And I think, these kind of resources you're referencing, they are sort of demystifying the prejudice, the bias, but of course it still exists. I mean, many people still probably wouldn't even know what it is if you say the word, right? Depending on where you
Right.
are in
Sure.
the world or in our country. Um, but it's starting, I wouldn't say it's normalizing, but it's starting to be known and more accepted. And the challenges come when it comes to the legality of it, right? So there's two places in Massachusetts that legalized a multiple partner, acknowledging multiple partner unions and having non-discrimination rights for people who are polyamorous, which is incredible. And so that's where there's still an uphill battle. Right, for people, three parents, let's say, of a child all being on the birth certificate. How do
Wow.
people who are
Yeah.
in a four-person marriage, they might call it a marriage, but how do they get legal rights to insurance, to estates, to all of those things? And people are coming up with creative solutions for that. Like they're becoming LLCs, right?
Oh,
Or
interesting.
having a trust or
Wow.
something,
Yeah.
but so this would be, or just the standard plus one,
Right.
right?
Right.
Right, yeah. And the assumption that people are married in the first place. I mean, single people have to experience this too. Just sort of you
Yes.
invalidate it unless you're in a relationship.
Yes.
So yeah, there's still a lot of misconceptions to work through, but I think there's the increase in resources, which is great.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. And that's fascinating. LLC. I love that. My wife's an estate planning attorney, so I need to ask her if she's come across that. But I think that just like, the uphill battle of even just legalizing gay marriage, much less, poly marriage
Marriage,
is
right?
going to be really interesting. Um, so before we finish up, it's such a powerful segue into parenting,
Yeah.
in when you're in a poly relationship, and I know you have a son,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
he's grown up in, as far as I know, pretty much
Yeah, in a
in a
poly
poly. Yeah.
or situation, yeah.
So tell us what you'd recommend, but both in terms of, to other couples or other people out there, single or otherwise. And I love that you brought up that, and I've seen this happen so often, that if you're out there and single, whether you identify as monogamous or
Whatever
polyamorous,
you identify as, right?
right, that you've been dealing with the same paradigm struggle that anybody in a non-traditional situation, because being single in our culture, particularly past a certain age, is non-traditional, and
Totally.
you are stigmatized.
Exactly, right. The stigma of not being in partnership.
Right.
Yeah. And then the
A
stigma of being in too many partnerships.
right. That it's very
Yeah,
similar, actually.
yeah,
Yeah.
right. It is
Yeah.
similar. Yes. So, I mean, similar to what you were starting with, the diversity of being in a village. I mean, that's the ideal for children to be raised in. Nuclear family ain't cutting it.
Right.
Yeah. That there's multiple generations around, there's multiple families around, there's children of multiple ages as well that support each other. There's multiple women breastfeeding children, just like that's I mean, from gut diversity to human diversity, relational diversity. Like, yes.
Yes. Yes.
So, yeah, I mean, I'm not currently living in a community like that at all. But yes, our son has grown up with knowing that we can love more than one person and we can be in relationship with more than one person. And there's nothing wrong with that,
Mm,
long as it is ethical. And that doesn't mean you get to do whatever you want whenever you want, right? There has to be care and consideration along the way. It's easier to talk about it with your kids when you're doing it from the start because they just grow up with it as sort of
right.
this is a part of life.
You're instilling the new paradigm from the beginning.
Exactly,
Yeah.
from the beginning. And he knows about the like he knows that
Sure.
grandma and grandpa are monogamous, like he knows there's a
Yeah.
difference, you know. Um, but it can be harder when you're coming out to your kids who are, teens, older, and people have an array of different experiences. Some kids are like, great, that's kind of the norm anyway, right?
Right. Well,
These
especially
days,
it
for
seems
the
that,
younger
yeah,
generations.
new generation,
Yeah.
absolutely. So you do find that the newer generation is, I mean, it's certainly what I've found to be true is
Yeah.
that this new generation is, it's like they're much more open and
Yeah. Well,
ready to
it's
dive
like
in.
I have a sister that is 12 years younger than me, and she has like monogamous guilt. It's so cute. She's like,
Oh,
she's like, I just can't be. I know I should be polyamorous. I was like, what are you talking about?
that's adorable. That actually is
Right.
that I'm going to take that
Right.
with me. That's
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah.
So that I think it's it's not as assumed in the same way that it was for maybe my generation, your generation,
Right.
like what
There
we
wasn't
grew.
even a word. The word
There
didn't
was
exist.
the
Yeah.
worst didn't exist. Yeah, I mean, it was something that like my aunt and uncle who were literally at Woodstock, like, it was something that they kind of did, right? Like as hippies. But I don't even know if we had the word open marriage then
Mm.
for what they did, that my aunt occasionally had a boyfriend, in addition to her husband's,
Yeah.
right? There wasn't language for it. Um, but what I caution against, and this would go the same for people that are monogamous, but maybe divorced and they have multiple partners through the years, marriages, boyfriends, girlfriends, like being careful about our children attaching too quickly to adults that
Mm.
aren't fully ready to commit to that child, not just even to the adults,
Beautiful.
right? So that happens. I see it even in just divorced families as well,
Right.
right? Where there's a lot of adult figures. So for me, my son might know some of our partners as adults in the same way they would know my friends that care about him, that are a person that exists in his life.
Right.
But it's not until there's sort of a certain level of real, I'm in an attachment bond with this partner, and there's a level of commitment that then, you know, I'm letting them sort of attach more to him or him attached to them.
Right. No,
Yeah.
that's beautiful. Yeah. Well, it reminds me that the two sayings. One is that, it takes a village to raise a
Mhm.
child. And the other is that we do know in attachment theory, the multiple attachments for a child is very good, is healthy.
So
You know,
beneficial. I mean,
the
that's for
more
all.
secure attachments. Yeah. The secure
Yeah.
attachments.
No,
Yeah.
that's personally my resilience didn't come from my parents. It came from these step parent figures that I
Mm,
had. There were many,
interesting.
but there were actually, we named, right, one of their spirit animals was
Oh,
the
yes.
eagle,
The eagle.
right?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So that was an attachment figure that, I wouldn't be who I am without having had him in my life.
Ooh, do you mind sharing a little bit, just because we did a synchronicity that this eagle showed up just before we started the podcast? What's his
Yeah,
first
so one
name?
of his name is Chris, and he's
Yeah.
passed. Um,
Mm.
but he was one of my stepdads. He lived with us from when I was 7 to 10. But then when him and my mom broke up, we kind of stayed together. And like he met a woman later and was like, I kind of have this stepdaughter. Like
Aw.
we're gonna be together. You have to accept that I have a stepdaughter. And she and I had this great relationship. It was
Hmm.
really beautiful. And then I was like babysitting their kids, in college kind of thing.
Wow.
It was a really powerful relationship.
That's
And he died.
beautiful.
Yeah.
And it helps me because I do know, especially in polysecure, you talk about, you know, the challenges of growing up in a pretty, traumatic childhood with a
Yeah.
lot of trauma going on. So that these kind of connections to some healthier, more stable, secure
Exactly.
attachment figures was critical and that they came from step parents, not biological.
Right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
that's beautiful.
Exactly. So there's such a benefit from having more adults around.
Yes. That's
Yeah.
beautiful. Well, yeah, this has been so great. I just have wanted to have you on this podcast for ever since I thought about doing this podcast. And I thought, and this kind of goes in with the eagle too, because I have this saying. I don't know who said it, but it has stayed with me, particularly when I started writing books, releasing music, and now this whole thing with film and podcasts I'm exploring. And it's very simple. It says, if you want to fly with eagles, you have to get used to high places.
Mm,
And we've had a discussion about, when you do reach for your dreams, you often have to overcome this sense of insecurity, the negative
yeah.
idea. And this is paradigmatic. I mean, this is part of our paradigm too, that, you know, don't fly too high or don't.
Yeah, don't show off, don't be
Right,
conceited, right? Like,
right,
grew up with a
right.
lot of those narratives. Who do you think
Yeah,
you are? Yeah.
exactly. Play small, et cetera, et cetera. But you've mentioned, I think it was Guy Hendricks who wrote the book The Big Leap.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if you could maybe leave us with, even with, because you have, in even the time that I've known you over the last 4 years, 3, 4 years, however long it's been, it's been really beautiful and inspiring to see how you've, literally moved onto the international stage with your work. And when you maybe advice about, uh, making that big leap, and when you
Yeah.
overcoming those negative self messages, and because yes, I see you as an expert in this, but I also see you as in embodying your soul work, that it comes from such a deep place for you, which I think helps you, maneuver and navigate a lot of kinds of pushback you can get from our culture around this work.
Yeah. Isn't it incredible? I have not had a lot of pushback.
Oh, that's beautiful.
I
That's
feel so
inspiring.
fortunate.
Yeah.
Not that it hasn't been hard to open up. Like I've talked about this in other places. I lost friends when Dave and I opened up who didn't
Wow.
want anything to do with us as polyamorous, just as a
Wow.
friends, right?
Sure.
Yeah. But in terms of professionally, I haven't received any negative pushback or, there's mostly been a lot of support. Yeah, which is great.
Yeah. Well, you're paving new, you're giving language to a lot of things that people, I think, have thought or felt, particularly veteran therapists. Like for me, it was like, oh, I wish I had this book
Right.
30 years ago to give
Yeah.
people.
Right. Yeah. So you packed a lot in there around the big leap, taking,
Yeah.
and that is referencing, yeah, Gay Hendricks' work of where we can go from sort of the stages of incompetence to competence to excellence. And we often get stuck at excellence. And the big leap is into our brilliance and our genius. And it was years ago I was reading that book, and I knew I was in excellence at my job at that point. Where you get good feedback, people like what I'm doing, there's job security kind of thing.
Yes.
And I could feel though that, this isn't why I'm on the planet.
Mm.
I'm doing great work, right? And I'm helping other people, but I'm doing their work.
Wow.
And there's something that has always been kind of burning inside of me, that there was a bigger expression, a bigger contribution that I wanted, to be and to really feel like um, we all have our own gifts, and that I'm sharing my unique combination of gifts in a way that is meaningful to myself and to others. And that's what I was really looking for. And um, it's a non-negotiable for me. Like there
Mm.
was times when I felt disconnected from that and didn't want to live if I felt disconnected from that.
Mm. Wow. Yeah.
So it's really significant, right, to sort of, I was going to say find my purpose, but I've actually really deconstructed that find was the worst word
Mm.
in this, that it was
Yes.
actually allowing my purpose and
Mm.
uncovering my purpose. This idea of find got me stuck for a long time. Like it's not
Yeah.
out there to find and then voila, right? To weave together the purpose that was already happening. So yeah, is it a lot. And I talk about it at the end of Polywise, the second book of writing the first book, and having all this doubt, right? Going to the Boulder bookstore and seeing thousands, right? Probably hundreds of thousands of books, and being like, what on earth do I have to contribute here?
Mm.
Right? Like feeling overwhelmed by it, and yet wanting to be a book on that shelf at the same time, and things like dyslexia that I struggle with, like, just think, how could I? And yet, not allowing the fear, acknowledging the fear, and not living my life from the fear. That's
Mm.
also an important thing in being able to take that leap, is to leap with the fear. It's not the absence of it.
Oh,
Yeah.
I love it. Thank you
Yeah.
for sharing that. So inspiring. And yeah, I remember that part at the end of Polywise. And it actually, one of the taglines for the other side of things is no one knows everything, but everyone knows something no one else knows.
No, I love that.
Right. And it's this
Yeah.
idea, this particular, specific, our own perspective, our one unique individual perspective that only we inhabiting this particular body at this particular time in this particular
Yeah.
place on the planet. And that's why I like to think of soul work as this individual, unique, one of a kind, like our thumbprint. It's the one thing only we can do, the only thing that we can manifest. And that's where I love when you said, I really like this. It's not finding, it's allowing, which makes me think of, and this is from Mark Nepo, another friend and mentor. This, he'd say, how does a flower bloom? It turns itself inside out. And so
Mm,
it is this kind of both the weaving and then bringing in. So because I'm certainly, as I'm launching this third career from, psychologist, author to musician and now filmmaker, I'm going, what are you doing? But it's
right.
following this river of my heart that kind of twists and turns. And we had a discussion once where you said that too. It's like, well, it's always changing, right? It's
Yeah.
always changing. The big leap is it's a shifting, moving shoreline or river.
Yeah.
So I think that
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to say about that, but what is
I
on the horizon for Jessica
Right.
Fern?
Like, I used to think, like, I would, before writing Polysecure, I would listen to podcasts and I would feel envious. Like, how
Mm,
do they just talk? How do
mm,
they just talk about a topic,
mm,
and educate on a topic, like, off the cuff?
yeah.
It felt like what that would take for me to be able to do that. Like, I'd have to memorize all this stuff, And that was such a big leap to think,
Yes.
right? And now I'm like, yeah, okay, I can have a conversation with someone, right? Um, and what was the felt like a big leap then is now normalized,
Yes.
right? And now there's the next leap.
Beautiful.
Yeah, so it doesn't end. We don't leap and then arrive and it's final at that place, at that destination. There is sort of the continuous evolution of what the
I
next is.
I
Yes.
love that. Yeah, no, I remember, here I was, I did these keynote concerts for thousands of people. I could get on stage and perform for thousands of people. And then I went to yoga teacher training. And I remember going to my first yoga class to teach, and I was terrified. It was like the competent guy who did these other things, but it was the first time I was doing that.
Right.
And I'm feeling a little bit about that with my film work right now. It's like, and I have had friends going, how I remember 20 years ago, your first album, you were terrified. So that's a really great reminder, is that until something gets normalized, no matter what it is, and I guess we could come full circle and say, talking about feeling polyamorous with a partner or friends or
Mhm.
with your admitting it to
Just with
yourself,
yourself.
right?
Yeah.
It can be terrifying. And
Yes.
yet, just begin the conversation and giving yourself a chance to not have. I think the biggest thing, what I found so often, is not being reactive to ourselves,
Mhm.
right? Like being curious about these, that you are I like to say that, this soul is an old growth forest. Be curious. You almost have to allow the ego to give way to you being aware of the beautiful diversity and vastness of who you are. And that when you're exploring your soul work, imagine you're going into kind of this inner wilderness, and we'd even say in the vision quest work, we go into the outer wilderness as a symbolic way of going into our inner wilderness, which is this beautiful varied terrain. And that in those ways, we're, I think, I don't get to share it this way often, but, you know, um, in some ways we are the ultimate mystery, even to ourselves, and to be curious
Mhm.
about that and allow yourself to not know, allow yourself to be curious, allow yourself to learn about who you are. I think that's what we mean by inner work or soul work is, especially when we're working with people, how they can be reactive to their own thoughts and
Mhm,
feelings, right?
mhm. Yes, exactly. I think that's a huge thing is because it probably a voice jumps in, a critical voice that says, don't. How could
Yes.
you? That's
Yes.
selfish. That's
Yes.
this, you know?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So to ask that voice that shuts down the desires, can you just step
Yeah.
aside for a minute?
Yeah. And let's just be curious. Let's be
Right.
curious. It doesn't, nothing has to change or happen. So a thousand thank yous, Jessica. This
Yes,
has been such a delight,
thank you,
you know.
Michael.
And is there any way, as far as anything you'd like to leave our listeners with, and also how people can find you and learn more about your work?
Yeah, they can find me at jessicafern.com is the best place.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you again. And we might have to have you back, but I'm just so thrilled to have had this conversation with you. And I really want to applaud you and the work you've done in the world and are doing. And I look forward to whatever else Jessica Fern gets up to in the future.
Yeah,
So,
we'll talk
again,
about shame next time, maybe.
oh, wonderful. Is there a new
Yeah,
book in the works?
there is. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
is that the theme, the main
That's
theme?
that's the theme. Yeah. Working with
Yeah.
shame and the inner critic and the ways we escape. So it's
Wow.
inner parts, inner healing work. Yes.
Yeah. No, I'd love to have you on because that is to me such a universal issue in our culture. Guilt
Mhm.
is feeling bad about something we did, but shame is feeling bad about who we are. It's that core sense of
Yeah.
identity. Yeah. Bless your heart. Well, thank
Yeah.
you for the work you do for so many. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in for this episode of The Other Side of Things. We'll see you next time. Thank you for tuning in to The Other Side of Things. I have been your host and guide, Dr. Michael DiMaria. You can find out more about my work at michaeldimaria.com. Explore the books, music, and online programs and films. And we'll see you next time on The Other Side.